And I want to thank everybody who is joining us this evening. As I talk, I want to invite you to just look at if you can click gallery view at the top right corner, and just give yourself an opportunity just to look at the faces of the people who are in this room. Yeah, I see the smiles. Even the names, even those of us who are not in video, just read their names, say their names, look at their pictures. Just take a moment, you know, hey, hey, Sunny. Special shout out to Dr. Mariana Soto Manning, a colleague from Teachers College. So, part of what we want to touch into today is, um, it's an interesting moment where it feels like time is accelerating. I don't know about you, but I feel like there's just so much happening, at a collective level, at an ecological level, at a personal personal level, especially me as a first time dad, um, navigating parenthood during the pandemic, witnessing parents, uh, you know, become older and more vulnerable to the realities of aging, uh, having experienced the loss of my maternal grandmother, who was 93 years old and is the reason why my entire family came from the Dominican Republic to here. So I'm still processing the emptiness there. I'm trying to fill that void with some kind of meaning, um, and how that relates to just how I'm showing up to work and to all the commitments that I have professionally. So today's conversation is really close to my heart, and I want to not take full credit for the idea that really came through our fellow Jackie Ivy. Jackie approached me wanting to have this conversation, and part of what you all want to know is that we have 25 incredible fellows. The Garris Institute Fellowship Program was founded in 2020. Um, I helped to design it and to set it up, and we started with 11 fellows from all walks of life, from the field of neuroscience, architecture, psychology, performing arts, just an incredible group of people. And we spent 2 years um, doing slow work, slow work, slow work. So at its core, the fellowship is founded and undergirded by four particular pillars: awareness-based contemplative wisdom. So, thinking about all the contemplative tools from mindfulness, meditation, embodiment practices that we have curated as a human species, found in many spiritual and religious traditions, refined in the recent iteration of the scientific community, like mindfulness-based stress reduction and those other modalities that now are secular, if you would say. So thinking about awareness-based practices, the science of interconnection. What does neuroscience say about kindness, about compassion, about the power of contemplative practice and how it shows up in our bodies, in our neurochemical composition? Generative action. In light of everything we're going through, what are some steps we can take to intervene and to act upon the world, to change it and make it better? And then lastly, collective healing. Collective healing. So how do we think about understanding that there are serious structural forces that continue continue to cause trauma at the level of race, at the level of sexual orientation, at the level of gender, at the level of class? And then how do we think about interventions that curtail the power of those forces that cause collective trauma in order to facilitate collective healing? So this is big thinking, right? But and we do that and we did that, but part of what I want to say is that yes, that's all important, but what's more important is not what we do and what we talk about, but how we do it and how we talk about it. And there has been a gentleness and a slowness that we've tried to cultivate in the fellowship, to the point that it's been hard for some fellows, like hard. Like the first 6 months of the fellowship, we're doing nothing. We're just sitting with each other, resonating. What's coming up for you? What's in your heart? What is the edge of your work? What's blocking you? And there comes a point where it's just hard. You just see it's beautiful. It's like, oh my God, what are we doing? I need to do something. No, you don't. You just need to chill. So Jackie is part of our first cohort, and she's been so generous to bring us our two guests, Karissa and David, today. So thank you, Jackie, for answering the call and for being so generous. What I'll do now is I'll talk a little more to give us some more grounding around what we're trying to do today, and then I'll step back and allow Jackie and our guest to sit a little bit with my framing, and then Jackie will ask a couple questions to elicit some conversation between Karissa, David, and Jackie, and then I'll come back in and I'll engage us all in a conversation with the audience. So it'll be a community event. How does that sound? Sounds good? So allow me to just share a little bit about this notion of relational sense making. You know, relational sense making, interesting. Why? Why add relational to sense making? Why sense making as a powerful conceptual tool for making meaning of the world? At the core, we are making sense every second of our day. We are constantly taking in information, evaluating data, assessing, thinking through what are the most important parts of this data and how we're integrating it and responding to it. So sense making is kind of a thing we do as human beings, engaging our senses. And in fact, we survive and thrive on that act. And part of what is important to note is that relational sense making is part of a rich tradition of attempts to name the things we do as a species that allow us to understand, cope with, and integrate ourselves in the larger world. So for example, things like emotional intelligence, the work of Dr. Daniel Goleman, 1999, the book comes out, becomes a phenomenon. Oh my God, we need to cultivate our emotional intelligence. Things we already, a fact that we already knew, but at that point in the history of this country and in the academic community, introducing the concept of emotional intelligence in the context of business in particular was a revolution. That we needed to become more self-aware of how we were feeling, and that we needed to become more aware of how others were feeling and develop the savvy to navigate that interplay, that dance. So emotional intelligence and social intelligence emerge as really exciting and provocative concepts in the scientific community that begin to be studied, developed. So you have training programs around emotional intelligence. At the same time, you have the evolution of systems thinking. Scholars like Peter Senge, Otto Scharmer. So in a beautiful way, in the community, you have this interest in developing emotional and social intelligence. And then you also see this pattern of systems thinkers. So all of a sudden we have all the scholarship around systems thinking and being able to understand that not only are there things happening at the larger level, but that there are deeper patterns, deeper psychological, societal patterns that are manifesting in systems-wide behavior. So the evolution of emotional intelligence, social intelligence, systems thinking at the turn of the century is pretty much very strongly related with this history of relational sense making, trying to identify what are the skills and tactics that we can deploy to make sense of our relationships to each other and the larger society. Now, what I also want to say is that relational sense making is also connected with the rich history of how we engage in ethics, in Western culture. So how do we decide what's right? How do we decide what's wrong? In the Western canon in particular, you have all kinds of theories: deontology, teleology, virtue ethics, consequentialism, all these rich theoretical approaches that allow us to evaluate our decisions. Oh, I'm going to make this decision because it has the potential to make the greatest impact on the greatest amount of people. Utilitarianism. I'm going to make this decision because there are more negative consequences than there are positives. So consequentialism. So relational sense making not only is part of the lineage of skills like emotional intelligence, compassion training, kindness, pro-social behavior, things like teamwork, things like collaboration, but it's also part of the rich history of how we engage in ethical conduct and moral decision making. I'll close by saying that not only has the pandemic broken our hearts open, and I want to take a moment to invite a dear friend called grief into this space. Just if any of you have lost anyone, just want to send any tons of energy your way. If you've lost anyone during this time to COVID or not, just acknowledging that. Take a moment just to acknowledge that. Even though we're at this really interesting point where we're past the pandemic, but we're still in it, playing hopscotch with it almost. But what's important to understand is that I think the strings of our hearts have been pulled and played in some profound ways during this period. The social distancing, the air hugs, the Zoom calls, the hybrid learning, the hybrid teaching, the hybrid working. So now more than ever, we have been called to engage in relational sense making. How close do I get? How do I navigate a virtual space in the context of really important work that needs to be done? And more importantly, that not only did the pandemic reveal just how vulnerable we are as a planet and also how interconnected, But that right in the middle of the pandemic, especially in the United States, we saw the emergence of a social justice movement in response to the murder of Black life in public. So how do we make sense? How do we make sense of that colleague? How do we make sense of a world in turmoil? One, and two, what are the relational containers, the relational capacities that we need to make meaning of the world in such a way that would allow us to wake up every day and try again and again and again. Last point. We are also embedded in a political economy that is based on constant growth, extraction of value from bodies, from material, from elements, causing disequilibrium with Mother Earth. And so we're also living in a political and economic structure that is pushing us. So then the question is, what is the role of balance? What are the levers of balance that allow us to be in full integrity, socially, emotionally, spiritually, especially at work, in light of everything we're holding? So we have our guests here who are coming from an array of backgrounds to have a conversation around, like, can we achieve work-life balance in the context of living in such a society? And what is the role of relational sense-making as a tool to allow us to evaluate what's right for us, what's in alignment for us? Am I clear? And I'll close by saying that the term relational sense-making was coined by our fellowship. The term was coined by us, so we are still figuring out what it means. So that's why I constantly try to open with a little bit of context. So I'll step back. I've spoken enough, and I'd love to invite Sister Jackie. Thank you, Jackie.
That was right on time. So I want to, thank Monique and Jenna and Angel for being here, and really from the bottom of my heart, and also thank Karissa and David, who are dear friends and people whose work I admire greatly. And so I'm really touched that everybody is here today with us. Shout out to my friend Barnaby, another one of our fellows, and probably a few others that I might be missing. And part of the reason that I wanted to bring, in particular, these Karissa and David together, and I'll go a little bit into their bios, but also allow everybody to read that on their own through, the Garrison. And then I know Monique and Jenna will throw up some links to each person's individual work in the chat. But I've known Karissa about 12 years and David not quite 1 year. And so there's a quality to both of them in their presence and in the way that they have been influential to me in my personal and professional life, that I will try to convey and get to kind of an essence of. And I think it ties directly into Brother Angel's setup of relational sense-making. So Karissa is trained as an organizational psychologist. Just once you hear her Southern accent, you can't help but drop into y'all. So mind my dropping into a slightly Southern twang when I hear her speak. And she was first a friend, and then when I was in the throes of some professional kind of quandaries in a corporate setting, trying to, in a way, I didn't have this language yet, but make sense of, do some relational sense making around things that weren't adding up to they weren't integrated yet. They weren't making logical sense with my emotional, social, heartfelt sense. And I was struggling. I was really struggling, and she could feel that. And so I brought her in to work with my team. And the best way that I can describe it is really allowing us the space, almost the slow work, as we would call it, and gave us all permission in our studio to be with what was happening, like not to jump to a conclusion or jump to a judgment or jump to what we were going to do about it, but truly allowed us to be with what was. And it wasn't, and also she allowed for it to not be, it allowed for it to be neutral. There was kind of an energetic exchange that was happening, and Karissa was able to frame it for us in a way that was pared down and allowed it to land, at least for me, allowed it to land in my body, and I think in other people's bodies. From there, we were able to decide what action could we take, should we take, and to make sense of it from that place. And I think, as my fellow Jennifer, who I don't know if she's on tonight, this evening, but Jennifer Bloom and I were speaking earlier in the week, and she was talking about the holographic view of a dynamic form, and I really liked that, because it's almost that prism nature of, we can all be looking at something and see it completely differently. And so more recently, within the past year, as I've gone through my time with the Garrison Fellows, and I was lucky enough to be laid off during COVID and have taken some time with my fellowship to say, hey, what's next? David has really been supporting me, and Karissa, but David has been playing a much more active role in helping me step into what that could look like. And again, allowing me to be with what's happening in me and allowing it to land in me, because I'm not quite so sure sometimes. And the commonality, I was thinking about it today, the commonality is they are both able to bring about a presence that allows us to find this momentary form that allows us to live into ourselves and our beings that is not static. It's like it's allowing it to be stable enough to exist in this moment, yet also free enough for it to morph and change. And with that, I think echoes into what, Angel, you touched on. We have to be willing to be with loss and grief. And so as we move through our lives, professional, personal, there is loss. We can be, unfortunately, assured of that. Yet there isn't always a comfort in being with it. So with that, I wanted to, one, give both Karissa and David an opportunity to, one, just what's alive for you right now, just in your lives and where you are. And if what I have said, what Angel has said, lands for you, doesn't land for you, and what thoughts you might have about that. So, Dr. K, I'll let you go first, if that's cool. You're muted, darling.
No, I'm not. No,
Yeah.
I'm not. Correct. Yes. Yes. So a lot of response, Angel. Thank you for framing that up, and Jackie, for your kind words. Relational sense making. So one of the things that I feel very passionate about in my career and in my current work is, I'm a psychologist, but don't tell anyone, but I'm very anti-Freudian. Everybody who knows me knows this. I have real issues with Freud. I think Freud made wonderful contributions, but it's time we killed the word conflict, in particularly inner conflict, because I think about various parts of ourselves, and we won't even go to our external environment yet, but this notion of inner conflict, and how do we morph that and live out not inner conflict but a necessary conversation. There is a part of me that signs up for everything, and I get enthusiastic, and then I get tired and I burn myself out, as opposed to thinking of that as conflict. What if I thought of that as a conversation that I should have when I start feeling that way? And to me, that is a revolutionary way to look in the mirror. It's a conversation. I think it's fair, once we come outside of ourselves, as well, to use that necessary conversation model. The other thing, I guess, Jackie, before we shift to my colleague, I have been spending a lot of time post-pandemic in thinking through, where are we in this moment? Because like Angel, I just sense a lot of churn. I will never forget George Floyd Day, as long as I live. And out of that experience, wound up asking myself some deeper questions about what I wanted to do with my life. For me, that meant making a turn and going to seminary, which was not something I saw coming. But out of that, I really have come to this conviction that we live in a moment where our choice isn't God or no God, but it's faith. It's this belief that who we are and what we do matters, versus nihilism, which who cares? This sort of neutral, checked out view of life. And that's where I spend a lot of my time. I don't think about asking anyone if they're balanced. I ask them how alive they are. Because coming to life is, and waking up, those are the kinds of things that are occupying who I want to be in the world.
Love that. And very true.
Thank you, Brother Angel. Thank you, Sister Jackie, Monique, the Garrison Institute, for having me. So many places I can go with this conversation. I think one of the main things is thinking about what do words mean to you? Where I have a very interesting relationship with words, and I look at, where did the definition come from? Who installed it? And how do I play out that? And is it congruent with who I am? So whenever I feel new terms come out, I almost do this inner engineering process within myself, and I kind of look at what that means internally. My career has primarily been, I would say, a spiritual technologist. Been an entrepreneur my whole life, built multiple ventures, And I kind of looked at technology as a possibility of how do we raise consciousness on this planet? How do we empower individuals through technology? So relational self, like, if you think about that, right? It's like what is that relation? That's the first thing that I really think about. Like, what is that relation with yourself, right? How do you make sense within yourself? Me as a builder in most things, whatever that we're creating on the outside is just a reflection of the inner engineering that I've done on the inside. So for me, words are very powerful. Adoption of frameworks are very powerful because I'm using that to create external worlds and what I'm building as an entrepreneur. So I really sit with new frameworks and things like that because my background has been a technologist. I'm very heavy in crypto and heavy in building decentralized autonomous organizations. So I've been in blockchain, which I think blockchain is a spiritual technology, using that to build out new frameworks of companies, countries, new models of industries. So we're looking at that at a very deep level and understanding what is the language? What is our relationship with this technology? How do we think about what have we already learned and what do we need to unlearn to use this new technology? So one of the challenges in our field is centralized psychology is trying to use decentralized technology. It's a very it's a very challenging thing because you have, as you can imagine, with crypto, those of you in it, all the experiences you're going through, the media clips, you see FTX, you see Terra, you see all the speculative projects that come and go. It's almost like oil and water, right? So when you have a centralized group of thinking that's trying to control decentralized technology, you're naturally going to have a separation of the two. And so it's one of those things, sense making in our field is really experiential, right? It's really understanding how do you do that with yourself at a very deep level. For me this year, Angel touched on so many things, right? He talked about the pandemic, all the political ecosystem, what's happening in the world, ethics. I really paused. I just did this like really big spiritual trip. I was in India with Sadhguru and we were doing this amazing hatha yoga process. I've been a hatha yogi for over a decade and I try to bring in yoga into all the work that I do. And that's really the spiritual piece of the technology. And what came to me really out of this whole trip, it was about 3 weeks, was simplify to purpose. So really it was about simplification is actually speeding up. So instead of looking at everything that's happening in my life and trying to get overwhelmed by it, I just look at what is important, what can I simplify, what can I move towards, and what can I change my focus and bring clarity to it. Confidence without clarity is a dangerous place. So for me, I try to look at new things that get introduced to me. What is my relationship with that? Does that fit with my purpose of what I'm trying to do in the world? And I look at it very practically. And I use those frameworks. If it does make sense, I bring it in. If it doesn't, I kind of put it to the side. And that's how I navigate the crypto market. You can imagine how intense and how fast moving building in that space can be. We have the industry changing weekly. It's a 24-hour marketplace where GM means good morning when people are doing that at 8 p.m. They can do that at 8 a.m. GM is now a standard of Web3 and in crypto, doesn't matter where you are, you say that. In that type of a nonstop 24-hour marketplace, you can imagine the level of dysfunction that we're dealing with. So everything you all are doing with the Garrison Institute, every fellow, with the projects you're talking about, it's so relevant for my space. So when Jackie invited me to this talk, I was like, this is so important, right? Because you have these young individuals building future industries, future cities, future countries that are not talking about these things that the Garrison Institute is talking about. So it's really important to, I think, cross-bridge networks, cross-bridge information in a way that it can be utilized on the ground for builders as they're building these new ecosystems and new futures. And I'll pause there and I'll hand it back to Jack.
what I really appreciate about how both of you responded, one, I think when this term relational sense making, I don't know, came about, to your point, David, it's not like we didn't really need a term, but everybody was like, what are we doing? Like, we're doing something, we can feel it energetically, we can feel this kind of like this shared energy and excitement and growth. So shouldn't it have a name, like, so we were like, okay. But I think you're right. Like the term or the name is less important than the feeling that it emotes in each of us. And I think what's also interesting, and I'd love to hear both of you speak to it, because I know a little bit about, in both of your worlds, that this is important. I remember David telling you about this concept that one of the speakers or one of the scholars, people that came to speak with our first cohort, Garrison cohort, was Adam Horowitz. And Adam has this really fascinating term called sacred hospitality. He wrote a piece on it on Medium. If anybody hasn't read it, I highly recommend. And he founded a nonprofit a handful of years ago called Nuns and Nons. And the basic premise being that these nuns realized there wasn't a huge amount of people coming up behind them into the convent, and that their knowledge and way of being would probably come to an end in the near-ish future. And they wanted to make sure that the wisdom that they knew that they had kind of cultivated together, living with one another, wasn't lost. And so the nuns, either non-nuns or non-Christians or whatever, they invited in to live with them and begin to really get specific and be clear and also simple about what these kind of principles of relational living, co-living, what were they? How would they speak to them? What would they do if there was, I think, Karissa, you said not conflict, but like energy or, like liveliness.
Yeah,
And
attraction.
and how would that be resolved? And I know, David, a little bit more about, in speaking to you about DAOs, and if people don't know, maybe you can speak a little bit about that idea in Web3 of coming up with not just shared purpose, but shared accountability towards each other, and how one not only takes responsibility for oneself and one's own actions, yet also with compassion can point out to a friend how maybe, begin to call into question or add some curiosity to, hey, I think this is what I'm hearing. I'm not quite sure. Can we kind of go into it a little bit more and talk about it?
Jackie, I'll just pop in a moment. I think that the notion of nuns and nons coming together is fabulous, because I think that one of the things that has happened is that writ large, we are all cloistered in our own worlds, much more so than we used to be even 50 years ago. But I think this notion of me coming into contact in intimate space and just listening to someone who's very different from me is hard. It's difficult in our day and age, but it's also redemptive and transformative. And I think any time that you can bring difference into space in a way that it is safe, is part of the mission. It's part of what needs to happen. I think about kids, and I think about kids, how well equipped are they to deal with difference? How well am I equipped to deal with difference? And where is it that we can, with nuns and nons, or with Buddhist and Hindu and Christians and nuns, God bless a nun, NONE, and all of us come together and find ways to say, I really don't know what's going on here on the earth. I'm not sure why I'm here. Because only, as a friend of mine named Stephen Cope used to say, only reality is wholly safe. And that is the terrifying reality that we are all living with. None of us have certainty, but we grasp and we feel meaning. And when we allow it to happen, magic happens on occasion.
I love that.
Yeah, I think I'm all about stories and like experiences in life, right? So I was just in Singapore, and it was Chinese Lunar New Year, and I'm hanging out with a bunch of friends. Some of my friends are Filipino, some of them are Taiwanese, some of them are, Cantonese, we got Indians, and we're all eating dim sum, right? And we're talking about life, we're talking about all these different things. And I just like paused for a second, and I was like, it's hard to have this in the US. It was just like a real moment for all of us to just like pause and go, US is currently very separated, right? And how do we deal with this? Like, how do we deal with what's going on? And, there were expats at the table. There were like Singaporeans at the table. They were like, everybody had their different perspective on what they thought was going on in the US. And really, it's just about what's happening on this call, right? Like literally, what we were doing was what's happening on this call. Everybody was just getting together, sharing perspectives, sharing life experiences, showing up in an authentic way where they felt safe, they felt seen, and they were talking about life from their perspective. And there were innovative conversations happening. There was like problems about water shortages. There was like a soil project that was being spun up at that table, just because we were having a dialogue and a discussion across the aisle, across the table, with various individuals with background. I feel, especially after COVID, like what happened, there was like this fragmentation of the country, and people just didn't know how to come back together. And that unity, I think, is still being figured out. What is America today, right? That's like the sense, that's the feeling that I have as a leader. And every room I walk into, people are trying to, they're worried. They're like, am I going to say the wrong thing? I'm getting canceled, or I'm going to do, this is going to happen. And like, nobody feels safe, right? And then technology just amplifies baseline in a lot of ways, right? So if there's tremendous amount of fear that's happening in a country or a system or whatever it may be, the technology is almost neutral by design, by the architects, but it'll just grab onto algorithms or patterns or whatever it is and just amplify that, right? So what I've noticed as a technologist since 2020, everybody's kind of gone into a silo, right? Like you kind of think you're pretty woke by having your curated feeds and trying to follow the right people and do all these things. But the algorithms are learning what you're liking, and then they're giving you more of that. So the 4 Black people that you might know, right, that just got funding might become 100% of your African-American funding like perspective or experience. And now all of a sudden I'm talking to a top VC, they're like, oh yeah, we're definitely hitting our minority quota, right? And I'm sitting there going, like 1% of your funding went to minorities, specifically African Americans, right? And their LPs in that fund have no visibility. They're like, wait a minute, that can't be the case, right? So this is happening for leaders. This is happening for individuals. This is happening for the average person. So we have to be really mindful about what is it that we're partaking in technology, right? Like, what is it that we're trying to follow? How do we curate things? Really be mindful of like, what is it that how much screen time are we doing? And what is it learning about us? What is it amplifying about us? One of the things is to stay neutral. Using technology is one of the hardest things because it amplifies whatever your predominant patterns are. And this is where I think, like, if you think, look at ethics in technology, if you look at the work that, if all of you watch Social Network or Social Dilemma, the documentary, it talks a lot about this, right? So in this fast changing world and this like uncertain world where it's like America in a lot of ways feels to me decentralized. Like there's literally this decentralization happening and everybody's just kind of, the affluent are going to places they can go, and then they're kind of leaving problems behind and kind of gone, right? And if you pause for a second and go, that's like just spreading the problem in a lot of ways. You're just kind of going to the next place and doing this again. We have to really look at ourselves as individuals and go, what is it that I'm feeling? What is it that I need to do in order to have a conversation with someone that I didn't feel comfortable having a conversation with? How do I show up in those conversations? How do I feel safe? How do I voice those things, right? Because until we do that, have those conversations with each other and show up, it's really hard to look at societal or industry problems. Like one of my things I always say is like, to innovate a company, you have to innovate yourself. You have to really innovate and change yourself, right? Every 7 years in the yogic cycle, your system changes. So if your body, your energy, your mind, everything evolves every 7 years, like almost like a snake just losing its skin. For you to change every 7 years, for you to evolve, for you to like learn new things and show up in different ways, I think that's a beautiful thing to honor, right? With everybody's process. I think we have to do this at an individual level, have these types of conversations, because I think without it, we just get more fragmented. We get more decentralized and the problems just become bigger.
And I think the other thing, David, being real is messy. Being real is not always pretty.
Yes.
And what happens when I do say something racist in front of a friend of mine who's not white? What happens next?
Yeah.
And that's where I think that's the messy process, where there's great potential in this moment, because there is sensitivity and there is more awareness on so many levels. But I think part of authenticity on any level, physically, emotionally, relationally in particular, is that moment when you mess up. We in some circles use the term forgiveness, have an open heart. If someone just truly messes up royally, what happens next? What happens with the person? How do I handle it when I mess up? Am I so ashamed that I go back into my hole and I'm like, oh, let me get my feed, where it's only people I like, let me have the MSNBC crowd. It's and so I think that those moments when we can move out of, okay, we messed up, life didn't end, but what am I going to do in this relationship next? How's that going to be received? And guess what? I messed up. Am I going to keep trying? Am I going to keep reaching? Am I going to keep growing? James Baldwin, a wonderful 20th century theologian, philosopher, all around brilliant person, said, that it's in the reaching, it's in the grasping, it's in the growing. And that's what life is, and what it's all really about. So it's a messy process when we start showing up real. But oh wow, what's the ticket to the show? I mean, we're missing the show, by staying in our corners and, enjoying ourselves, as opposed to being in joy, in a different way. I think sometimes I get tanked up about this, obviously.
I love you, Karissa.
No, I think that's a super, super valid point. I mean, that's really what it is. Like when you mess up is an opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. But Silicon Valley and all these industries, like they created innovation models around what you just said, right? Because they realize that when you mess up, when you fail, like literally that's the moment you learn the most, and you need to apply. You need to like immediately lift yourself out of it, like literally fail fast,
right?
Push to fail. These terms come from Silicon Valley because what they realized is, okay, to have innovation to make billions of dollars, we need to put people in the room that look very different. Let them work on things together. Let them fail at a high level, and then get back up and keep going. And that will result in an innovative industry, company, whatever. That practice 100% agree with you, is literally the human process. It's like the running joke. If we're all babies or we're learning to walk,
Yeah.
and then you fall down for the 10,000th time, did your parents pick you up and go, all right, Karissa, no more walking for you. We'll put you in a wheelchair. Right? We're gonna put you in a wheelchair because you're done walking.
That's it. Yeah.
Right? No more walking.
You
for you.
failed.
No more failing.
Yeah.
No more failing, right? But somewhere along the road, we go from failing is a natural process in which we just like, and again, Silicon Valley, you know, the areas you get rewarded for this monetarily, where I go into a room with Google X or whatever, and I'm like pitching something, and then we do something, we completely fail. And the recovery time of that failure is how fast I'm incentivized. So just think about that for a sec. Monetarily, I am incentivized to fail fast. So what do you think I do when I go into innovation rooms? I break as many things as I can, because I'm just like, okay, that you guys never been to that part of something. Let's go over there. Let's see what we can do over there. And then all of a sudden you're doing stuff. And then more importantly than failure, what's happening is the teams that are building something, the cohesiveness, the alignment, the synchronicity, the relationship building, the emotional intelligence, all these terms that we've thrown around are just sinking and going up. And whether you come out and build something or not, you walked away with relationships that you can literally go build whatever you want with after that kind of moment. And which, by the way, in a nutshell, that's what Silicon Valley is. If you really think about what they've done for the last like 30, 50 years, they basically, like a top VC funds, they would invest in a founder, and then the founder would go try to do something at the highest levels and fail. They would take that founder and they would drop them in Google or drop them in some, you know, the top the fangs of the world, you know, Facebook, Amazon, and so forth.
Yeah.
And then they would basically learn and apply that failure inside of that multi-billion-dollar ecosystem. And then they would just like get better and then put them back as a founder, round two, go again. And then all of a sudden you see an Airbnb pop out and everybody's clapping and say, wow, Brian Chesky, you know, Airbnb. But what you described is a pivotal part of that process, which is they failed. It was messy. It was problematic. The only thing was there's somebody next to them saying it's okay to fail.
That's okay. So,
right.
Mary,
really?
Yeah, Mary just put in the chat, and I really appreciate it. She said, I'm curious about the slow, fast tension in this conversation. I'm not clear about how contemplation relates to failing fast. And I think, David, what you just said, because in my example, say with Karissa, when I was still in a corporate setting, when I could perceive that I felt our team was quote unquote failing, yet to admit that in corporate culture was like in the power dynamic was like death, you know, like literally they were not happy. They did not want to hear about failure. That was like the worst thing. And so and I didn't have the skills at the time to be, I could meditate and I could go to work and do my job, but I didn't know how to be mindful in my work. And so I think, to your point, when there's not somebody in your team who's saying, great job, you just failed, it's a lot harder.
Yeah.
And you're a lot more likely to that life work, home, kids, family balance. I feel like that's one of the moments where it all goes whack, because we're trained in this country a lot of times, or I feel like I was trained in this country to do better, you know, a linear progression. And so as happens, things aren't linear. But when that reality bumps up against a culture where I can't talk about that, I keep pushing harder and harder, faster and faster, and trying to do more and more. And that's where I feel like, Karissa, what you were saying about that burnout is, you know, it's kind of like where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I think the question is really good because, you know, the visual, you're thinking about failing fast, you're thinking about being in action, in constant action. versus contemplation, where we at least visually tend to think of it as a more still process. But I think contemplation can also be thoughtful action. So I used to say, David and I have different personalities, and I used to say to clients all the time, "You're brilliant. I want you to be 5% more thoughtful." And I meant that. I didn't want 10, I didn't want 15, I didn't want 20, because I didn't want to mess with the secret sauce. But I think that gets back to your wiring and your architecture of self. And I'm not going to go Freudian on you, but I think that whole your own contemplation, what do you say to yourself when you fail? Because I don't know about other folks, but that's been the hardest part for me to get better at, honestly. So years ago, when I was doing a lot of work at Kripalu, a friend of mine said, you really should try loving kindness meditation. And I had a big business. I was very busy. I didn't have time to sit around and be kind to myself. This was my response. I'm just being honest. And this friend of mine said, well, Barbara Fredrickson at, UNC, big time scientist who you probably like, Thacker, has been studying this. And I'm like, okay. And so, I said to her, so, okay, I'm going to give this a try. So Sharon Salzberg was actually at Kripalu. I got to meet her, got to get acquainted with her, went through a program of loving kindness meditation. And I still find that practice. And honestly, when I start beating myself up, I go right back to it, because just because I got better at it 2 years ago doesn't mean I won't fall back into it. So I think that to the listeners, to the question, I do think, there's these systems in this outer picture, but then there's this architecture of self that we want to kind of consciously plan out. And there are so many wonderful tools. And I'm like a disciple of loving kindness meditation now. I think the science is correct, not shockingly, but it can make a real difference. And it's a simple way to start a contemplative process.
What is our relational sense making around failure? Right? That's a good one to each of you to think about that for yourself.
Yeah.
Totally agree with Chris, what she just said around the compassion piece, because that's a big one for being able to be an agile failure or being able to be a serial failure. You have to look at yourself in a different way. What is your definition? If you have this definition of success, of how you should be, right? You should all over yourself. And then you don't meet that, then failure becomes Mount Everest.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's really, she said, it's really powerful, because that's where it starts, is first having compassion. And if you notice you're struggling with failure, it's okay. Just pause, feel, what is it you're struggling with? I'm struggling with, like, I failed because I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I feel these things, and you're having all the self-talk. Just maybe sit with that. That's okay. Right. They're just passing things that somebody has programmed somewhere along the road in you, and that's not who you are. So you just sit with it and just have a little bit of separation from that process of awareness. When you fail, that's a powerful moment for you to see everything that shows up that usually doesn't show up. So adversity is a perfect time to look at I would say, the operating system of what the software, the base, the deep level software that's running in your system. What is it that shows up, right? And then you see, like, if the code isn't efficient, it's not efficient. Okay, then I need to do a software upgrade here.
Yeah.
Right. So then your relationship starts changing with failure slowly.
Yeah. And if you can slow down and hear the garbage, or
Yeah.
I'm labeling it garbage. That's how I do it. Sometimes I'll say, okay, I'm going to take a piece of paper and, I'm shooting myself. Great Albert Ellis term. He was one of our most profane psychologists. Don't stop shooting yourself, and you can kind of see that stuff. And I have often myself written it down and then wadded it up. It didn't necessarily go away and it was gone, but there's something in that motion. And I think, like David said, I mean, maybe the contemplation is when you are conscious enough to actually hear it, because for most of us, it impacts us without us giving it a full hearing. Paradoxically, it has less power when we give it a full hearing as opposed to pushing it away.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I mean, I think awareness is the first step. I think really becoming aware, right? A lot of the meditations that I do, and I think in general, they kind of give us a little bit of space from our thoughts. So realizing we're not the mind, right? Once you say, I'm not the mind, I'm not the body, well, what are you? That's a deeper question for you to explore, but that's where you can literally start a little bit of separation. Because if you build that separation into awareness, into that separation, now you can view as the observer what is happening within your system, what is going on with you. Then ideally you want to cultivate some sort of practice. This is one of the things that, whether it's yoga, whatever you choose, you pick that practice to take that awareness and just make it bigger, almost like a wedge. Make it bigger. You train it to keep that space always, right? And then when you're constantly failing, you're constantly experimenting new things, it's like muscle memory. What ends up happening is like breath work, right? You fail, and all of a sudden your recovery time gets shorter. And then, you're kind of really disassociating yourself from that failure too. You start thinking the failure is not me. It's just a sequence of events that I just tried and it didn't work. Right.
Yeah.
So then the magic starts really kicking in, right? Then you're just like, okay, you don't take it personally. Because once you take things personally, what ends up happening is that you just, we trip all over ourselves and all these thoughts come in. And the next thing you know, you're in this reactive cycle. There's awareness has completely gone out of the picture. So you need that awareness to separate the body and your mind and just not make sure you don't take it personally. And then once you have a practice, the third thing is individuals around you, right? I love Kobe Bryant, right? Like watched basketball my whole life, and like Kobe's dad was one of his big things. In his interview, he said, he was going to play the big game in his life, and he was missing all the shots, and he lost that game. And he came back and he was like really beat up, just like down, like, man, how did I miss that shot? How did I miss these shots I'm always making practice? Like just really hard on himself, right? He's like, I failed, like. And his dad said, hey, look at me, son. Just remember, you can fail all that you want, but I will still love you. Right? So when that happened, I think that was like unconscious and unconscious permission for Kobe to fail at the highest levels. And that's really what makes greatness happen. So once you have that unconscious permission kicked in, where you're just like, my action is going to yield some sort of result. And I'm going to look at that result and make the best decision and adapt according to that result and then make the next move, versus stuck on that one result so bad. At that point, what ends up happening is that you're no longer present. You're actually in the past. You're actually now evaluating what you did in the past, and you were completely lost sight of what's happening literally in the present moment. So this is where the whole fail fast thing comes from, is because what they want you to do is fail and then be present.
Yeah. Right.
Fail to the present. That's really what they're saying. Fail to the present. I want you to fail to the present moment.
And like I've been reading a few of the questions that have been coming in on the chat, is if we don't have a practice of doing that, to your point, whatever that might look like, yoga, basketball, Sarah, to your question about art, and for me, especially with a visual kind of an artistic way of being, the ability to observe, like, and my dearest friends who are amazing artists, they used to call it using a painting, and they would take somebody's, one of there were three of them, and they'd take one of the three of theirs painting, and what they would call it, is it to death, and it was like, what is it? And well, it's like paint, and it's like, collage, and it's canvas, and it's like, well, what is that? And, they said they would just get so close to what is it? It was like they were going to lick the painting. And a lot of people don't have that practice, or haven't practiced that way of being with something, a work of art. So I love, and what part of what I love about this conversation, and actually what both of you have helped me with, what Garrison's helped me with, and especially, who's the basketball player who said you miss 100% of the shots you don't take? Exactly. It's like what Sarah was able to give me, actually, as a neuroscientist, was I brought her into Nike, and she was able to describe some neuroscientists and the kind of the fight and flight, what was going on in our brains. And all of these very linear thinkers were like, oh, I got that. That makes sense to me. And so all of a sudden, it wasn't about somebody, freezing or fighting. It was like, oh, that's a neutral neuroscientific occurrence that's happening in every single person's body. And just by Sarah describing that, it kind of neutralized it. So, yeah.
And I think the other thing, we talk a lot about mindfulness, and a term that I just read from a wonderful monk named David Steindl-Rast is bodyfulness. And this notion of whatever your practice is and how do you integrate the body. Man, we are in our US Western culture talking, walking heads. I mean, there's such pressure in our culture to just operate like a head. And I think that it's an act of resistance and rebelliousness to live in your body in this culture. And that to me, in terms of authenticity, it's a huge part of it. It's a huge part of it.
It's so funny, Chris, you said that. It's like, we are walking heads. It's like, my teacher just recently said this on a trip. He goes, first time he heard the term stress management, he was kind of puzzled about that. He was like, stress management, what does that mean? And then he was like, I thought you only manage assets, like your house, your finances, and then he's like, why do you manage stress? That means you're assuming your system should always be under stress. That just means you don't understand how the body works and how the mind works. It has nothing to do with making that a normal process, right? So practice, I think, to your point, what you said earlier, doesn't matter what it is. It's like, when you get started, you'll feel better. The sooner you get started, you'll feel better. So it's like Tai Chi to mindfulness to bodyfulness to yoga to basketball. Have a daily practice, right? Wake up in the morning, take a little bit of separation from your mind, take a little bit of separation from your body, right? And just connect with yourself, right? One of the things I'm a big proponent of is like, how do we create intentional spaces, or how do we create intentional places in people's homes so they can do this practice? Because one of the biggest things I figured out working with entrepreneurs and investing in so many entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs are just like, it's like the house is like the wild, wild west. They'll be on the laptop on their bed. They'll be like on the kitchen. They'll be sleeping in the living room. And I turned around and I was like, hey, do you have a place in your house where you can just sit and be? And they were like, yeah. I sit and be everywhere. And I'm like, no, like somewhere you can just go and sit. And functional spaces where if you're in your kitchen, you're cooking. If you're in your bedroom, you're actually sleeping. If you're in your office, you're actually working. Do you have functional design in your space? And most of the entrepreneurs I work with don't even have that. So what I literally requested in the last talk that I did of like 50 entrepreneurs, I said, can you guys give me an 8x10 space, maybe a yoga mat or something in your house where you can go and just sit, where you can go and just no meditation required, just go and sit and just observe what is happening in your mind. What are you saying? People are like, oh, I failed at meditation because I couldn't quiet the mind. And I go, don't worry about all of that. Just sit, right? And just see what's going on with yourself first, because we first have to see how are we feeling, what's happening within us. Then we can respond to whatever is happening in our life. Most leaders that I'm working with right now, they are not even sitting.
Yeah. Oh,
know,
no, absolutely not,
you know?
David. Absolutely not. I had a client one time and I encouraged her to put a yoga mat in her, I think it was her living room.
Yeah.
And I would say, well, how's that going? She was like, I've got to move that damn thing. And,
Yeah.
and I kept pulling the string. And I'm like, I don't care what you do on it. Don't do anything on it, but don't move it. You got to
Don't move
live
it.
with it. Yeah, don't move it. And, we had this whole sort
Yeah.
of thing, going on. And finally she said, okay, I got on that damn thing. And I said, okay, talk to me, what happened? But anyway, it turned into, no video, no down dog. But to your point, it was a trigger.
Yeah.
In 3 minutes, I mean, in a role, if you have a big job, 3 minutes of contemplation can make a huge difference.
Huge.
If you have a small job, if you have kids, which I
Yeah.
don't, but I have empathy for it, I can imagine that 30 seconds of contemplation could be very helpful at times.
Yeah.
But I think that we humans are really conditioned by triggers and finding ways to make the triggers work for us and create behaviors that we are actually who we want to be.
Yeah.
Is very powerful.
I learned this while I was living in India. And they have, like, if you go to certain families' homes, they have like prayer rooms or meditation rooms.
Yeah.
Back in the day, those were the largest rooms in the house.
Wow.
And now what they've done is they've outsourced there to a closet, right? Or the smallest part of the room, because people used to come and sit all together in the meditation room and just sit, or they would just pray. And this was a cultural process that would happen in India. And industrial age and capitalism kind of went into those Eastern markets, we basically have outsourced, spirituality to the mind and really taken it out of our experiential lives. And that's what we need to bring back, is like the word yoga literally means union with oneself. Yeah. So it's not about downward dogs and doing a bunch of flexibility things or pranayamas. It's about understanding, take a moment to connect with who you are and be able to go inside and say, today I'm feeling uneasy. And that's okay. But at least I know I'm feeling uneasy. And that's where you start. Imagine when somebody's feeling uneasy and they pick up their phone and they tweet. As a leader of 100 million followers, they move markets.
Yeah.
Because of their uneasy feeling.
Yeah.
Right. Because they haven't become aware that how I'm feeling, currently I'm in a reactive mode. So I'm going to pick up my phone and just say all the things that I want to say on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I'm changing geopolitical areas. I'm changing markets.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a practice. They don't have a simple thing as a little bit of awareness to understand what's happening, right? So I think what separates leaders from conscious leaders is an active practice. Yeah. If you want to be a conscious leader, you have to have an active daily practice, whatever you decide that is for you, but make sure you keep that going. Just the way we do physical workouts, we need to do mental cleaning. We need to take care of our inner space as much as we need to do our physical space on the outside, our body. We need to make sure, how do we do mental hygiene? What does that look like for me? And whatever that is, you decide. And then you take a little bit of space from yourself through that process. Because what I find is so many leaders are so influential, so powerful, but they're just not aware of how they are even coming across and what they're doing. And they're managing their teams and their company in a very reactive way. And then they're turning around and going to coaches and therapists and saying, why is my life chaotic? And you're just like, wow, like, you're a billionaire, you're an industry leader. Like, take a moment to see how you're feeling, because you're setting the new trends of industries in the world. right?
Yeah.
And I feel that's the biggest thing that's we need right now is conscious leaders more than ever.
Absolutely. And I do think sometimes, our leaders, and it's very visible, and I won't name any names, but I think there is this hungry ghost, that can take control of human behavior.
Yes.
And, what are you chasing, and knowing what you're chasing. It, and to your point, David, I mean, our impact, some people are in powerful roles and that's more obvious, but I'm often aware of impact that I've had for negative or positive way down the road. And so I think it behooves all of us to be more conscious of that. And in some ways, it's a positive, that we're not neutral, that we are, what we do does really matter. Back to my faith versus nihilism thing. What we do does really matter.
Yeah.
Well, and on that, I was just texting Angel. I'd love for him, if he's willing to kind of come back in as I want to be true to everybody's time. But I think the power in that, and what both of you or what I hear both of you saying, is modeling, just modeling. And it, whether you're a parent or a whatever, fill in the blank, whatever identity, I have found, especially with teenage children, that the more I do my work and model a way of being and presencing with my girls, it doesn't take any time at all for them to pick that up.
Mhm. Yeah, it's been fascinating to hear the conversation. I'm creating space for myself to integrate what I heard, and I want to give the audience an opportunity to engage us and themselves. Also, but I also want to respect time. So I want everybody to just take a moment just to do a quick body scan. So just take a deep breath with me. Just a nice, gentle, deep breath. A couple more gentle, deep breaths, almost like if we're doing a relational contemplative practice. The breath has a metabolic function as well, not just at the level of being able to convert and transmutate oxygen into this vital element that keeps us alive, but the breath can actually metabolize your feelings. So just taking a moment just to breathe in, and almost as if you're taking in all the wisdom, all the thoughts that have come through this conversation. And as you're exhaling, you're also processing them. Allow them to integrate into your mind, body, maybe even deep as your bones. And as you continue to breathe, just ask yourself, how is this conversation resonating with you? What's really present? What burning question is still there? Is there a word that can describe how you're taking this conversation in? So here we are, after that incredible discussion, just creating that space to allow our bodies to sense into what is there. And I want to invite you to, if it resonates, go into the chat. Thank you, Gloria. The word kindness came up. And in the chat, put the word or put the question that's still burning, put a comment. Just go ahead and, simply witnessing joy, joy, joy. I like the framing that came from Karissa, the idea of enjoying and being in joy as well. Enoughness, with what is, just be, hope, presence, resonance, empowered, embracing the messiness and imperfection, safe space embodied in the sacred space, important. So as we continue to integrate, I want to just share some concluding remarks to kind of close our conversation. What a fascinating discussion, bridging in so many different fields and gaps. Thank you, David, for bringing in the business world. Just thank you. I think oftentimes when we're in either spiritual or even social justice circles, it becomes something sometimes difficult to integrate folks in the business world sometimes, because there's just so much antagonism there on both ends. You know, in many cases, from the business perspective, is like the bottom line. Social justice doesn't pay. In fact, we profit from the pain. You know, on the side of community, spiritual, mindful, social justice oriented communities, sometimes there's a lack of awareness of the financial infrastructures and policies and processes that are needed to sustain business, to sustain markets. So there can be some shame around having conversations with that industry. So just thank you for being here, for inviting us to think about so many pieces there. Karissa, thank you so much. I can hear the theologian in you. I can hear the theologian in you. So I just want to appreciate you and for that subtle and gentle reshift from inner conflict to necessary conversation. From inner conflict to necessary conversation. I mean, I can feel the tension in my shoulders drop a little bit in thinking about that. That it's not, I need to, oh my God, I have this inner conflict that's swelling up inside of me and causing all this incredible tension. No, I have this momentum of this cluster of themes that are constellating around a particular issue that's generating the invitation for my awareness to be placed upon it and for me to be expansive around it. And even though directly, we didn't necessarily touch on this idea of work and life balance, I think we did. I think our relationship to failure is what's in that hyphen in work-life balance. Is our relationship to failure sits on that. Because depending on our relationship to our internal dialogue, our internal critic, depending on our relationship and how we are at work and are orienting around our performance, it'll actually shape how we both live and how we both work. So just really, really humbled to be with you all. And then I'll close by because as a scholar, I'm trained to be skeptical of not just who I talk to, but of myself. So I'm skeptical of the notion of relational sense making. So every time we have one of these, I enter the conversation questioning the very concept itself. And today, again, it just proves to me that it is a viable concept. It is an important conceptual innovation, just like bodyfulness as an extension of mindfulness, just as heartfulness, dropping into the heart in relationship to mindfulness. Relational sense making, I think, is still a strong player in this attempt of us as humans to evolve in an ever and ever evolving terrain. So with that, I want to thank everyone who came and joined us. You know, we'll have more Garrison Institute Fellowship forums. Look out for the one in February with, we'll have two in March actually, with our fellow Dr. Stephen Thurston. And then we'll have another one with Dr. Dan Siegel in March as well. Thanking all the fellows who are here today. I believe Barnaby's here. I believe Zara King, Dr. Zara King is here. And just want to close out, if it's okay with everybody, if you feel comfortable, with a gesture, just taking your right hand and just gently placing it over your heart. And just notice, whether you do it or not, just notice the shift in your field when we attend to our heart, when we attend to our relational selves. So much can happen. So much can happen. I invite you all to unmute yourself and say goodbye and appreciate our panel. I'll say goodbye how my grandmother says goodbye. Adios. Adios.
Namaskaram, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, Karissa and David and everybody for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
Talk soon.